The problem has now merged with the rise of an aggressive anti-Western autocratic regime in Russia under Vladimir Putin. Putin's Russia has quite deliberately pursued the policy of disrupting Euro-Atlantic integration of the Balkan region, most notably by its aggressive support of Serbia over Kosovo, which has effectively prevented a resolution of the Kosovo question. Russia has in recent years launched cyber attacks on Estonia, an EU and NATO member. Its secret service murdered the British citizen Alexander Litvinenko. Its air force regularly violates British airspace. And it provided military intelligence to Saddam Hussein in the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The Putin regime is a brutal regime that has carried out massive atrocities against its own Chechen citizens, that regularly assassinates dissidents and journalists. It supports other regimes hostile to the West, in Venezuela, in Zimbabwe, in Syria, and elsewhere. Yet, despite all this, Germany in particular has pursued a policy of active collaboration with the Putin regime in a manner that has caused a lot of unhappiness among the states of East Central Europe, in particular Poland and the Baltic states. And it makes it difficult for the West to take the necessary steps to safeguard the security of Southeast Europe. The most glaring example of this collaboration came in 2008. At the NATO summit in Bucharest in April of that year, Germany and France vetoed the granting of NATO membership action plans to Ukraine and Georgia, so as not to offend Russia. They also supported Greece's veto of the membership action plan for Macedonia. France's President Sarkozy has been particularly vocal in support of Greece over the Macedonian question, thus preventing any possible EU pressure on Greece to halt the bullying of Macedonia. And of course the question is, why exactly does the French President behave in this way? And one can assume it's to do with French investment in Greek banks and Sarkozy's own plans for the Mediterranean Union. Whatever they are, it's not really very commendable. Now, because Georgia did not receive the membership action plan at the time, it was possible for Russia to provoke a war with Georgia later that year. Although Georgia was a close ally of the US and has contributed a major military effort to the war in Iraq, it did not enjoy NATO protection. Russia smashed Georgia, and France and Germany worked to ensure any Western protest of this action remained purely formal and token. Paris and Berlin will not allow the Georgian issue to prevent them pursuing close collaboration with Moscow. Germany enjoys a profitable relationship with Russia in the field of energy and seeks to assert its own national interest through friendship with Moscow in a manner independent of the US and the rest of the West. While France, Germany's most important ally in the EU, also like from principle to pursue a policy that's independent of the Americans, not even at loggerheads with the Americans. It's almost like an enemy of himself. But over and above these narrow national concerns, the Franco-German policy towards Russia and towards Southeast Europe may be motivated by their perception of the sort of European Union that they want to have. Since they tend to favour a smaller and more centralised and integrated EU, they may share Moscow's desire to keep countries like Georgia and Ukraine outside of the EU. And they may be readier than the US or than the UK to consign these countries to a Russian sphere of influence. The Russian smashing of Georgia has effectively ended the ambition of that country to join NATO, probably the EU as well. And this is something that no doubt pleases the political elites in France and Germany. This policy is very damaging to Southeast Europe's security, as the interests and security of the vulnerable countries in the region, such as Kosovo, Macedonia, and Georgia, are sacrificed in the name of narrow realpolitik. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of the Franco-German policy is the alienation of Turkey from the West. Turkey is the most important country in Southeast Europe and a key member of NATO. It's a secular, predominantly Muslim democracy with a dynamic, expanding economy and a youthful population of over 72 million. Its geographical importance, lying between Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, is it's absolutely crucial. Thanks to its hopes of joining the EU, Turkey has over the past decade, under the leadership of the Justice and Democratic Party, been steadily democratizing. For example, by reducing the power of the army over the state, and by lifting restrictions on the use of the Kurdish language. The Turkish government has now for years been pursuing a moderate and responsible policy in Southeast Europe, pursuing détente with Cyprus and Armenia, and playing a positive role in the Balkans. It has recognised Kosovo, recognised Macedonia under its constitutional name, and has promoted reconciliation between Serbia and Bosnia. But for all that, the governments of France and Germany are vocally opposed to Turkish membership of the EU, as this would threaten their model, their favoured model of a narrower and more centralised European Union. And the language which is used to justify this exclusion of Turkey from the Euro is often really quite crude. During the election campaign, French presidential election campaign, Sarkozy was saying, how can you explain to French school children that we are a member of the EU which is a border with Iraq? How can that be in Europe? Forgetting that France is a border with Brazil through French Guyana. It's ridiculous, basically. And by contrast, governments such as the UK's, which support a broader and looser European Union, are supportive of Turkey's entry. But by destroying Turkish hopes of membership, Germany and France are jeopardising the democratisation process in Turkey. Because without the incentive of EU membership, the case for lifting restrictions on democracy in the face of opposition from Turkish nationalists and the Turkish army becomes much weaker. Turkey uses its incentive also to pursue a settlement of the Cyprus question. Turkey has also responded to its exclusion from the EU by developing its own regional policy, involving friendship with the anti-Western regimes in Iran, Syria, and Sudan. The Turkish government's rhetoric has in recent years become increasingly populist, involving global attacks on Israel, and recent democratic backsliding in general, in which the Turkish government attacks the opposition media in Turkey in a sort of democratic manner, and that problem has been becoming worse in the last couple of years. And so far, Turkey continues to play a constructive role in the Balkans, as it forges its own new role in the world, increasingly independent of the West. We don't really know how Turkey's Balkan policy will develop in the future. So for all the reasons that I have highlighted, and despite the tremendous progress made by Southeast Europe over the past 10 years, there are reasons to be concerned of what will happen in the region in the years immediately ahead of us. In geopolitical terms, the Balkans is not a region of great interest for Western alliance in its own right. In other words, it is not an area of great economic or strategic interest, equivalent, for example, to the Middle East or to East Asia. Rather, it is an area where battles are fought out that are primarily important for the impact that they have on geopolitical questions that extend beyond the region. For example, how strongly the West confronts Serbia's obstruction of Kosovo's independence, or how strongly it resists Milorad secessionist drive in Bosnia, will be related to the policy that is currently being pursued regarding Russia and regarding EU expansion. During the previous decade, Southeast Europe was fortunate to possess two leaders in particular who were not afraid to take necessary steps. And I'm thinking in particular of Britain's Tony Blair and the US's George W. Bush. And I should like to make clear that I'm not speaking favourably of British policy under Blair just because I'm British myself. British policy in the region has not always been positive, of course. And in the early 1990s, Britain was a country most to blame for the Western failure to oppose Serbia's aggression in Croatia and Bosnia. I've already mentioned Blair's role in turning the West away from collusion with Milosevic. And I should like to say a few words about the positive role that President Bush has played in the region. From the point of view of the Balkans, Bush's great advantage as president was that he wasn't afraid to take unilateral action where necessary, or to offend both friendly and hostile states. He was responsible, not just him, but in part, for two crucially important steps that I don't really have confidence the President US administration would have taken. Firstly, he recognized Macedonia under its constitutional name, and second, he recognized the independence of Kosovo. And the first of these steps meant defending the US ally, NATO member Greece. This might make sense, given Greece's general failure to support the US in any of its military interventions abroad, and given the widespread anti-American atmosphere prevalent in Greece. But nevertheless, not every US president would have done this. And just as a sort of point of comparison, Macedonia contributed more troops to intervention in Afghanistan than Greece did, despite the fact that Macedonia is not even a NATO member, was much smaller than Greece, but nevertheless contributed much more. Regarding Kosovo, Bush was ready to support a friendly and allied people, the Albanians, and to offend Russia, which again might make sense, given Russia's aggressively anti-Western policies under Putin. Nevertheless, his successor, Barack Obama, came to power speaking of a reset of US-Russia relations, and he immediately cancelled the missile defense shield that was to have been based in Central Europe, and he did this to satisfy the Russians without even consulting the Czech and Polish allies. And there was a rather interesting commentary on this by the conservative US commentator Charles Krauthammer, who I don't tend to agree with very much a realpolitik sort of champion, who was saying it might be worth sacrificing and betraying our allies if we were to get them to turn a real alliance with Russia, a real relationship with Russia. But what Obama did was he sacrificed the allies without getting friendship with Russia in return, so it was really a pointless gesture. The Obama administration is relatively uninterested in Europe and is unlikely to take decisive steps there, in Southeast Europe. At the same time, we are entering a more negative and conservative phase in European politics, as governments struggle to deal with serious economic problems, and mainstream politicians face a rising far right, represented by figures such as Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and Boris Sidorov in Bulgaria, and by groups such as the Sweden Democrats, the British National Party, and France's National Front. The more idealistic policies represented by leaders such as Bush and Blair have run out of steam, and Western leaders are struggling to compete with the far right. So we have Nicolas Sarkozy in France carrying out mass expulsions of gypsies from France, an act of racist xenophobia that has provoked much less domestic and international condemnation than would have been the case, like you might expect, I think. The far right has been achieving successes in the Netherlands, Sweden, and elsewhere. And in this climate, it's much more difficult to argue for principled, far-sighted policies in Southeast Europe. And there is a danger that the new aggressive forces in the region will not be met by determined Western opposition, just as was the case in the 1990s. The biggest danger to Balkan stability is currently represented by the regime with Milorad Dodik in the Republic of Srpska. The Bosnian Serb entity is the most glaring product of the unprincipled policy pursued by the Western Alliance in the early 1990s, and remains the biggest obstacle to Balkan regional progress. I think that Dodik is seriously pursuing the independence of the Republic of Srpska, and I don't believe that the West will offer serious opposition to this independence. If Dodik waits until